once upon a time, in a very faraway country, and I worked in video games, and one day I woke up and I tried to hack the Wi-Fi of my neighbor and said, well, maybe if I had a real job, I could pay an internet connection for myself. So I went to San Francisco to work for a startup called GitHub. So we're 12 people. So this sounded like a real job, and things are quite good. So I'm Vicent Marti, and people know me as VMJ. You can find me in GitHub, and this is my Twitter, and I work in the systems team at GitHub. We are the guys in charge of controlling the Ruby structure that controls all the GitHub stack. And this is about the horror stories that we have encountered over the years when doing enormous Ruby deployments in production. And these stories, we have hundreds and thousands of stories. Ruby is awful. But I have kept a few because I think these are the ones that are most interesting and that may be of great interest to you, and maybe the ones that you have encountered or might encounter in the future. And I have decided to tell these stories as if they were fairy tales, because if not, it's quite boring. I have lots of spare time, and this is what happens. So Chapter 1, Mark Sweep, the tale of the dumb garbage collector. And the story tells that in Ruby you have a monster, which is a garbage collector in charge of collecting all these objects that are in the applications and liberating them. And very little is known about these creatures because all the stories that have been written about them are written in an old language that is a lost language full of archaic symbols that we cannot decipher. In Japanese, well, this is in Japanese and we don't know about it. So this creature, in fact, are two creatures in the same body. It has two heads. The one on the left is called Mark, which is the most stupid of the two, the dumber, and the other one is Sweep, which is a bit cleverer but is still a bit stupid. And they are the Ruby garbage collector. And the garbage collector is conservative. This means that it doesn't really know what it's doing. It's non-deterministic, which means they don't know when they do it. It's stop the world. This means they hate you and they hate your good, and Mark and Sweep means that it's too slow. So basically, a shit show. So let me tell you how this works. When Ruby decided that they are going to use a garbage collector, the one who comes in is Mark. And Mark is in charge of working the object graph of Ruby and to marking all those things that look like Ruby objects. And this at Ruby level is quite easy. The variables are in the functions that we're using. And we're using all the different things. But things can become a bit more difficult because Ruby has be used in C. So it handles raw pointers to C extensions. And the garbage collector, who is not very clever, must find roots in the stack and the heap and the registers in order to find the pointers in the pure form of the binary application. So in practice, this is quite difficult to do, especially for a garbage collector. Well, they might say, well, this kind of looks like a pointer. Wow. Well, I guess. So what shall I do? Shall I mark it? Okay, well, try and see. So this is dramatization. So the garbage collector, in fact, does not speak at all. But, well, maybe he does call, but the story is in Japanese, so I really don't know. So after Mark finishes her work, Sweep comes in, and Sweep is in charge of cleaning up. So Sweep has a simpler job because he has all the objects set aside that the garbage collector created, and they only have to see those that have not been marked by Mark and burn them. It's quite simple for Sweep. Now, the big problem that Ruby has is that there is memory that is generated and that cannot be managed by the memory manager. The problem is at C level. So if we're in C and we have a string of characters, we have the value of our string, and this value is a pointer, and that is the value that the garbage collector knows how to treat. Now, as part of that R string, there is a pointer, which is a book reference. So that's a buffer with the characters that make up our string. So in order to work, we need to call the R string to obtain that character buffer. And the garbage collector in Ruby assumes something that is incorrect, namely that they think that if we use that character string, the reject object will continue in our stack. But this needn't be like that, because if we call up another function with a string of characters without using the Ruby object, the Ruby object needn't be there. It can be optimized out there and be replaced by the internal string, because we're no longer using the Ruby object, we're only using the characters that it contains. So the bad things begin to happen when I enter in that function that uses the internal buffer of the object. If for some strange reason something terrible will happen, because Mark will come in and will start to go through the stack and look for all those pointers in Ruby, and when they reach the pointer in the character buffer, they won't know what to do. They well, this is a Ruby pointer. Well, it is a character pointer, but they don't know that that is a pointer that is inside the Ruby object. So, because they don't realize this does not look like a Ruby object, this cannot be marked. And when they mark and this has finished, and Sweep starts to release all the objects, when they get to the Ruby object itself, they see it hasn't been marked because it is not in the stack. So it turns it on fire, and then it turns the buffer on fire because it is in the Ruby object. And what is the result? So when we go back to the application and see that buffer which we were working with, we continue working with it, but it's no longer there. It has been released by the garbage collector. And what happens? Well, I don't know how the segmentation happens, but it is like an explosion in your computer. Say, okay, what was that? Well, I think I broke something. Okay, I didn't do it. So you might think that this will never happen to you. Well, this happens all the time. And maybe you don't realize that this is a very serious problem and it has no easy solution. There are some solutions, but they are not very good. So the first solution is that you can drink yourself to sleep every night until you remain unconscious. And the story tells that if you're unconscious when production falls, they cannot blame you for it. Well, it works for me at least, and all the time. Now, there is another way that you can stress the garbage collector in critical paths, and this is a very technical way of saying that you can make your T-suite run until it goes on fire. When it goes on fire, well, very well. Now, how does this work? With the garbage collector, it uses a C library to generate memory. Then simply you activate the perturb mode. Every time you release memory, it is written with garbage. So if you access the memory that was released, you'll have a C segmentation every time. So at the level of Ruby, we activate the stress mode for the garbage collector. So whenever you can execute this, it can be executed. We can run our T-suite, and if there's a site where you can produce this, then you can find it. Now, if you want bonus points, you can do valgrind or asun instead of tampering by Murdoch, and this will give you very specific results as to where those accesses to the memory that has been released is taking place. The problem with valgrind and asun is that Ruby goes very slowly, and if in addition to that we activate the stress mode of the garbage collector, this will be far slower. So as you can see in this graph, you can see the real test suite and the heat death of the universe. So it will take some time. And the third alternative is the static analysis on the pillars generated for the application. But the last time I explained this at the Ruby conference, somebody jumped out of the window. So I'm going to save your suffering and go on to the second story. Chapter 2 is time is running out.
And it's a story of how these Ruby things work. When I started, I didn't work with Ruby, nor do I now. And we were working with an application, and I put timeouts. Do you know what timeouts are? Basically, it's cutting a call when it's taking too long. And to keep responsive, if it's taking too long, then you just cut it. And then I asked one of my colleagues, I said, what do you think about these timeouts? And he said, in Ruby, there are no timeouts. You can't cancel. And I said, have you looked well? There must be some. And he said, no, the thing is that the legend goes that the timeouts in Ruby are brought with a white rabbit like Alice, and the white rabbit always gets here late. So I tried to see what was going on. And I required timeout. I put timeout, and I called with a timing of 5 seconds. A call that I expected to take a minute, and I waited for 5 seconds and executed then 10 seconds. I waited 20 seconds, 50 seconds, and when a minute had gone by, then the white rabbit came. He was sweating. Sorry, I'm late. Sorry, I'm late. He was speaking Uruguayan. He said, llego tarde. Well, yes, you get a minute late. Now there was no need for you to come. It's already too late. He apologized, and he said, sorry, I couldn't come any earlier. And he explained what happened. And he said, you know how it works, a timeout of Ruby, how it works? And he explained, in Ruby, for a timeout, what we do is we throw a thread and we put it to sleep. The time the timeout has to last. So when it wakes up, it will launch the timeout, and it's when the timeout effectively happens. It's very elegant, I told the rabbit. That's beautiful, that's simple, it's nice, it's elegant. And the rabbit said, yes, it's beautiful, but it doesn't work, it's shit. It's wrong. So the rabbit talked about the inner things. He says the problem is that MRI 1.7, the threads are implemented as green threads. That means that the threads are not detected by the kernel. They're internal threads in the virtual equipment by its own scheduler and with fictitious tags. So the problem is that when one of those threads calls the system, the kernel puts it to sleep until the call finishes. When you write a file, the kernel reads the process of Ruby, and the green thread has to raise that exception for the timeout. It doesn't get executed because the kernel has slept all over during all the process. 1.93, the problem is basically the same. You must have thought that from 1.9 the threads are native, so in the kernel can see the different threads. But one of the threads calls the system and is blocked. The kernel puts it to sleep, and the kernel now is capable of waking another thread, the thread that needs to raise the exception. The timeout. But the problem is that Ruby has a GVL, a global interpreter blockade, that is necessary to raise exceptions or to do whatever. So if the thread is sleeping in the kernel, that one that called the system, if it has the GVL, then the thread that has to raise the exception, even though the kernel may wake him up, won't be able to do anything because it doesn't have an access and it won't be able to send it, and the main thread hasn't finished and may wake up again. This is terrible. It's a terrible feeling. As a matter of fact, that night I say, this is shit. I go back to video games. This is not my business. But I went to bed, and that night I had a dream. I met the spirit of an old man in a swamp, and I said, Obi-Wan, is that you? No, stupid, I'm Dennis Richard. And I said, sorry, Mr. Richards, I didn't recognize you because you are sort of evanescent. And Richard's spirit told me, use force, kid. I don't understand you. What do you mean by force? What are you talking about? You're an imbecile. You're a moron. Unix is the force. So I woke up, and the next morning when I saw my computer, I saw that in my terminal magically there was an open page of the manual of Unix telling me how to use the single. So now everything is clear. If you use Unix singles that exist since the 70s, then you put a signal. When you can call the system, the kernel has the alarm signs prepared, will wake up all the process, and from the signal operator we can operate the thread. It's very elegant, and other people have used it. And there's a gem that's very good that's called System Timer that works perfectly with Ruby 1.87. So that is how we solve the problem of timeouts. In 1.87 we use signals and the power of Unix. In 1.93 we make sure that all the native codes may always release the GVL before you make a call that takes too long. And I thought that this was good to finish with all the problems with the timeouts. But a few months later, it's good that the hardware of Apple is good.
Sí. Sí. A
few months later, in one of my trips in the own kingdom of Berlin, I found an old friend, Matthias Mann the Wise. You may know him because of his name, that is Matthias Meyer of Travis CI. And if you don't know Travis, look for me in the corridor and ask me because once you get to know him, and Matthias also has a book that is called the Reachenbuch. And if you use rack in production, you should buy the book. I promise you, he doesn't pay for me. It's really good. I think he's a wonderful engineer, Matthias. I was talking with Matthias, and Matthias told me, well, you know what? I too had a dreadful problem with timeouts. He was telling me, and he said, well, you see, we were using JRuby, and I stopped him and I said, you're using JRuby and you have a problem? Rather, you have two problems. And he said, you see, I was using JRuby and the GitHub API that kept breaking, and we had a call of API, and we had put a timeout in case it fell, so it wouldn't, our code wouldn't stop executing. And for some funny reason, one time that the API took too long and the timeout wasn't working, and everything fell because of that timeout that didn't work. And I told the magician, well, that's quite clear. The thread that had to do the timeout either was sleeping or was caught in the JVL. So he got his cane and he hit me, and he said, you fool, JRuby has native threads and fine-grained locking. There's no GVL. And the timeout, the thread in charge of the timeout always raises the timeout. That's a good thing. But he explained exactly what was happening with JRuby. The problem JRuby has is that you have two timeouts. The one that is the longer of the two is preference. It has preference, even if there's one shorter. So they had two blocks, one at 5 seconds and the other at 60 seconds. So, and one of them never worked because the other one had preference. So this is a clear example of why you have to use Unix, because it's easier and because, objectively speaking, this is a very ugly bug. In the scale from 1 to 10, this is very close to 10. So there are bugs in which you lose a night and others with which you lose your life. So it's very much to the right. But the problem is that the bug, I think, that is quite shifted to the right. It's going beyond the realm of bugs. It's traveling around the valleys of common sense and continue to walk and walk till you get to the mountains of reason. And you go up the mountains of reason, and then you walk, and finally you get to the country of what the hell are you doing, and you found MRI, Thomas, and green threads. So this leads us to my last story that's called The Princess in the Glass Tower. Isn't that beautiful? So I started telling you that I could have chosen million stories. That's a problem that Ruby has, and I chose only 2, but to tell you the truth, there's an endless number of stories I could have told, because the interpreter of Ruby, MRI, is fundamentally flawed. It has fundamental problems that have no immediate solution. If you're trying to use Ruby in large scale in a large company, you have huge problems. And the worst thing is that Ruby team is not interested in solving these problems. They are more and more defensive. They are more divide, and they have very clear interests. It's impossible to contribute in Ruby if you don't speak Japanese. So all the discussion of the problems of Ruby takes place in Japanese. And for the very few of us who can create patches, it's very complicated for them to be accepted unless you speak Japanese. It's a terrible situation if you're trying to use Ruby in a large company, because it's as if Ruby were trapped in a glass tower, like Rentmundsen, that is the princess that was trapped in a crystal glass tower. We could see her but not touch her. It's a very, very bad situation, and apparently nobody wants to rescue Ruby. Well, yes, there are people, there are knights with bright armors that for many years have tried to develop implementations. I remember Rubinius and JRuby. Those are implementations that have taken years and years, a titanic effort, not only because they have to re-implement Ruby from scratch, but they have to fight against RubyCo that don't want a standard of Ruby. They are not interested in the contributions. They only want new features that delay other implementations even further and making them slower and slower. So if, as a story, this is shit. This last story was terrible, but I have no more jokes left. So from the bottom of my heart, if you really care for Ruby, if you really love Ruby, this is what I'm going to tell you. I came here to tell you stories and to give you examples of how Ruby is broken, and now more than ever, the future of Ruby is in your hands. So if you really love Ruby, if you want to change the world using Ruby, now more than ever, Ruby's future is in your hands, and you can do a lot to help us. Even if you are not capable to contribute to Ruby, and you can help with JRuby. I'm sure you have a gem, and that just by testing it and making sure that it works in JRuby and Rubinius, that's sowing seeds for a better future of Ruby where we can all participate. So from the bottom of my heart, if you really care for Ruby, help us rescue our beloved princess from her glass tower, and let her rewrite JRuby and Rubinius for this fairy tale. Thank you.